Principal Gregory Lasker slid the termination letter across his desk before the ink on the incident report had even finished drying. He believed he was firing a liability. He had no idea he was firing a Medal of Honor recipient who had personally received that medal from the President of the United States 4 years earlier. Somerville High School had never quite known what to make of Laura Kingston. She had joined the history department 18 months earlier, 39 years old, with a slight but noticeable limp in her left leg that she never explained, and nobody had the nerve to ask about directly, though plenty of people asked about it indirectly. In the particular roundabout way, small-town gossip always finds its target eventually. "You should really see a specialist about that leg," Principal Lasker told her during her first formal review, tapping his pen against a folder that Laura suspected contained more notes about her physical condition than her actual teaching performance. He was a trim, meticulous man in his 50s who ran Somerville High with the brisk efficiency of someone who had once wanted to run something considerably larger and had settled, with visible resentment, for a public school district instead. "I'm not trying to overstep, Miss Kingston, but if you're having mobility issues that affect your ability to supervise a classroom of 200 students during a fire drill, that's a serious concern for this district." "My mobility is fine, Mr. Lasker," Laura said evenly. "It's a minor limitation. It doesn't affect my teaching." "It affected things during the pep rally in September," Lasker said, consulting his folder again. "Coach Barnes noted that you were slow getting your homeroom students to the designated meeting area." "I was walking, not running, because running down a crowded stairwell during an evacuation is how people get trampled," Laura said. "Every student in my homeroom was accounted for within 90 seconds of the drill starting. That's on record." Lasker made a small, non-committal noise and closed the folder. The particular gesture of a man who had already decided what he believed and had no intention of letting evidence complicate it. "I just want you to understand that this district has certain physical expectations for staff who supervise minors in emergency situations. I'd hate for something to happen that this school could be held liable for." Laura said nothing further. She had learned, a long time ago, in circumstances considerably more dangerous than a principal's office, that arguing with a man who had already made up his mind rarely accomplished anything beyond wasting breath she might need later. What Gregory Lasker did not know, because Laura Kingston had never once volunteered the information, and her personnel file listed only the barest, most sanitized details of her military service, was that she had spent 9 years as an infantry soldier in the United States Army, rising to the rank of staff sergeant, and that the limp he found so professionally alarming had been earned in a valley outside Kandahar during an ambush that should, by every reasonable calculation of the men who studied it afterward, have killed her and every soldier in her unit. Her convoy had been hit from 3 sides simultaneously, an insurgent force considerably larger and better positioned than the intelligence reports had indicated, and when the lead vehicle took a direct hit that killed the driver and wounded 3 others, Laura had been the one who dragged 2 of them clear of the burning wreckage under sustained machine gun fire, established a defensive position behind a low mud wall, and held that position alone for 11 minutes, returning fire with a wounded leg, and a rifle she'd had to reload one-handed, until air support finally arrived and broke the ambush apart. 4 men who would otherwise have died in that valley went home to their families because Laura Kingston had refused to stop fighting even after a round shattered part of her femur and severed enough nerve tissue that she would carry a permanent limp for the rest of her life. She remembered, more clearly than she wanted to, the particular taste of dust and copper in her mouth as she'd crawled the last several feet to the mud wall, dragging a specialist named Owens by the strap of his own vest, because her hands had gone too slick with blood to get a proper grip on anything else. She remembered counting rounds in her head, doing the arithmetic of survival, with the same flat, mechanical focus she now applied to grading essays, and she remembered the specific, disorienting silence that fell over the valley in the seconds after the air support finally arrived, a silence so total it had taken her nearly a full minute to understand that the fighting was actually over, and she hadn't simply gone deaf. 3 years later, in a ceremony at the White House that she had spent the entire flight to Washington trying to convince herself wasn't really happening, The President of the United States had placed the Medal of Honor around her neck while a room full of dignitaries and fellow soldiers stood and applauded. She remembered General Hale standing near the front row that day, remembered shaking his hand afterward, remembered him telling her quietly that he intended to remember her name for the rest of his career. A promise she had assumed, at the time, was simply the kind of thing generals said on ceremonial occasions. She had a photograph from that day, folded into quarters and tucked at the bottom of a shoebox in her closet, and she had told exactly 4 people at Somerville High School that she used to be in the Army, none of them anything more specific than that, because the medal, in her own quiet accounting of things, belonged to the men who hadn't come home, not to a story she wanted repeated in a faculty lounge. Coach Randy Barnes, who ran the school's athletic department with the particular swagger of a man who had once been the star quarterback of a team nobody outside the county remembered, had taken an early dislike to Laura that had never entirely faded. "She walks around like she's got somewhere better to be," he told the front office secretary once, watching Laura make her slow, deliberate way down the hallway between classes. "I don't get it. Kind of unsettling, honestly. Like she's waiting for something." He wasn't entirely wrong, though not in the way he meant it. Laura Kingston had spent 9 years learning to watch every room she entered for exits and threats, and that particular habit had not switched off, simply because the rooms in question were now filled with sophomores instead of insurgents. She sat at the back of the faculty lounge facing the door. She counted the seconds it took the fire alarm to finish its test cycle every month, the way she'd once counted seconds during far worse alarms. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the sound of a locker slamming too hard, and covered it so smoothly that nobody at Somerville had ever once caught it happening. The morning of the 11th of March started like any other, gray and unremarkable, with Laura midway through a lesson on the Vietnam War, a unit she taught with a careful, deliberate neutrality that occasionally frustrated students who wanted stronger opinions from her than she was willing to give. She was explaining the Tet Offensive when the school's intercom crackled to life with the particular tone that made every teacher in the building go instantly, coldly still. "Lockdown. This is not a drill. Lockdown. All classrooms. Now." Laura's body reacted before her mind fully processed the words, a cold, familiar clarity dropping over her, exactly the way it had, in that valley outside Kandahar years earlier. "Everyone against the far wall, away from the door and windows," she said, her voice dropping into a register her students had never heard from her before, flat, absolutely certain, carrying an authority that made 26 sophomores move instantly without a single question. She killed the lights, locked the door, and positioned herself between her students and the small reinforced window in the door, watching the hallway beyond with an intensity that felt, to her own private and uncomfortable recognition, almost like coming home. The intruder was a former student named Kyle Doran, expelled the previous spring after a violent altercation with Coach Barnes that had ended his athletic career and, in his own mind, his entire future. He was 19 now, angry in the particular unmoored way of young men who had spent a year alone with a grievance and no outlet for it. And he had walked through Somerville's unlocked side entrance, carrying a hunting rifle his father didn't know was missing from the gun safe, moving through the halls with the unsteady, dangerous energy of a person who had made a decision and was no longer entirely sure he wanted to see it through. He found Coach Barnes in the gymnasium, cornered him against the equipment cage, and the sound of his shouting, amplified by the gym's hard acoustics, carried down the hallway far enough that Laura, watching through the narrow window of her classroom door, heard enough of it to understand exactly what was happening 2 hallways over. "Stay here," she told her students, her voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Lock this door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but a uniformed police officer." "Miss Kingston, you can't go out there," a girl named Amy Reyes said, her voice shaking. "What if he has a gun?" "He does have a gun," Laura said, already unlocking the door. "That's exactly why I'm going." She moved through the hallway with a speed that would have startled Gregory Lasker considerably, her limp barely slowing her at all, once the old instinct took over completely. years of training overriding the careful, deliberate pace she used every other day of her life to avoid exactly this kind of attention. She reached the gymnasium doors and paused just outside them, listening, assessing. The same cold calculation she'd once used to read the angle of incoming fire now applied to the pitch of a frightened, furious young man's voice on the other side of a door. "You ruined my life," Kyle was shouting, the rifle wavering in his hands. His face streaked with tears. He seemed furious at himself for shedding. "You told the whole school I was done. You told colleges I was a problem. I had scouts looking at me before you opened your mouth." "Kyle, put the gun down," Coach Barnes said, his voice thin with fear, backed against the equipment cage with nowhere left to retreat. "We can talk about this. Nobody has to get hurt today." Laura pushed through the gymnasium doors slowly, her hands visible, empty, raised slightly at her sides, moving with the deliberate, unhurried stillness of someone who understood exactly how fast a frightened young man's finger could move on a trigger. "Kyle," she said, and something in the calm, level weight of her voice made him turn, startled, the rifle's muzzle drifting toward her, for one heart-stopping second, before settling back toward the ground. "Ms. Kingston?" His voice cracked, confusion briefly overtaking the rage. "What are you doing? Get out of here. This doesn't have anything to do with you." "You're right, it doesn't," Laura said, taking one slow, measured step closer, her eyes never leaving his face, her peripheral vision tracking the rifle's position with a precision that had nothing to do with a high school history teacher's training, and everything to do with 9 years of a different kind of education entirely. "But I'm not leaving that man standing there while you figure out what you actually want to happen next. So why don't you tell me instead? What do you want, Kyle?" "I want him to know what he did to me," Kyle said, his voice breaking. Nobody listened. Nobody ever listens. "I'm listening right now," Laura said. "You have my complete attention, but you're not going to get anyone to actually hear you while you're holding that rifle, because right now, all anyone in this building can think about is being afraid of you, and fear doesn't leave room for listening. Put it down, and I promise you, every single word you have to say, I will make sure somebody hears it." "You don't know anything about what I've been through," Kyle said, the rifle trembling harder now, his eyes darting between Laura and Coach Barnes, with the particular unstable panic of a young man who had run out of every plan he'd walked in with. "You don't know what it's like to have everything you worked for taken away, because one person decided you didn't matter. You'd be surprised what I know about that," Laura said quietly, something in her tone shifting just slightly, just enough for Kyle to notice, though he couldn't have said why it mattered. "I know what it feels like to have people decide, without asking you a single question, that you're not capable of the thing you've already proven you can do. I'm not saying that to make excuses for you, Kyle. What you did today, walking in here with that rifle, that's on you, and you're going to have to answer for it. But I'm not going to pretend I don't understand the feeling underneath it." Kyle's breathing hitched, something in his rigid posture loosening by a fraction. "Then you get it," he said. "You get why I couldn't just let it go." "I get why it feels impossible to let go," Laura said. "That's different from it actually being impossible. Right now, in this exact minute, you still get to choose which one of those is true." Kyle's hands trembled, the rifle dipping lower, his whole body seeming to fold inward under the weight of a year of unspoken fury, finally being asked, gently, to name itself. "I don't know how to put it down," he said, barely audible. "If I put it down, this is just over. I go to prison. My life is just over." "Your life isn't over," Laura said, taking another slow step, close enough now that she could see the exact tremor in his grip, close enough that if this went wrong, it would go wrong very quickly, and very badly for both of them. "But it will be, absolutely and permanently, if you pull that trigger today. I've seen what that decision does to a person, Kyle. I've watched it happen to people who thought they had no other choice left. There's always another choice. Right now, yours is putting that rifle down and letting me help you find whatever comes next. That's the only choice on this earth that doesn't end in something you can't undo." For a long, suspended moment, nobody in the gymnasium moved, the only sound the ragged edge of Kyle Doran's breathing and the distant, muffled wail of approaching sirens finally cutting through the parking lot outside. Then, slowly, his shoulders collapsed inward, and he lowered the rifle toward the floor, setting it down with hands that had gone entirely still, the fury and the fear both draining out of him at once, leaving behind only an exhausted, sobbing teenager crumpling to his knees on the gymnasium's polished floor. Laura crossed the remaining distance in 2 steps, kicked the rifle well clear of his reach, and knelt beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder, with a gentleness that startled everyone who would later hear the story, including, eventually, Kyle himself. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "That's the hardest decision you've ever made in your life. And you made it. That matters more than you know right now." The police found them like that when they finally breached the gymnasium doors, a sobbing 19-year-old on his knees, and a history teacher kneeling beside him with one hand on his shoulder, an empty rifle 6 feet away, and Coach Barnes still frozen against the equipment cage, staring at Laura Kingston as though he had genuinely never seen her before in his life, which, in every sense that mattered, he hadn't. Gregory Lasker arrived at the gymnasium roughly 90 seconds after the police, flanked by 2 officers and visibly shaking, and the first words out of his mouth were not for Kyle Doran, and not for Coach Barnes, and not even, strictly speaking, words of relief. "Ms. Kingston, what were you thinking?" he said, his voice climbing toward something close to hysteria. "You walked toward an armed student. You could have gotten yourself killed. You could have gotten Coach Barnes killed. You have no training for this. None whatsoever. And you took it entirely into your own hands without a single thought for the liability this exposes. He's unarmed and in police custody. And nobody in this gymnasium got hurt," Laura said, standing slowly, her voice flat and even, despite the adrenaline still roaring through her system. "That's the outcome, Mr. Lasker. I'd think that's the only part of this that should matter to you right now." "That's not how liability works," Lasker snapped, some combination of shock and wounded authority, making him considerably less careful with his words than he might otherwise have been. "You are a history teacher, not a hostage negotiator, and you had no business putting yourself or this district in that position. This is exactly the kind of unpredictable, reckless behavior I've been documenting concerns about since your first review." The words landed in the gymnasium with an ugliness that made even the responding officers glance sideways at him, and Coach Barnes, still pale and shaking against the equipment cage, found something like his voice for the first time since the ordeal began. "Gregory, she just saved my life." "That is not the point," Lasker said, though his conviction had already begun visibly cracking under the weight of every eye in the room, turning toward him with growing disbelief. "The point is that this district cannot have staff members making unilateral decisions to engage armed individuals. It exposes us to catastrophic risk. I have documentation going back months about Ms. Kingston's physical limitations, her unpredictable behavior, and frankly, her fitness for a role that requires sound judgment during emergencies." He turned to Laura, and whatever remained of his composure hardened back into the particular brittle authority of a man determined not to be the only person in the room who looked foolish. "Ms. Kingston, effective immediately. You are terminated. I'll have HR finalize the paperwork by end of day. This district cannot retain staff whose judgment creates this level of exposure." The gymnasium fell into a silence thick enough to taste. Laura studied him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and then, without argument, without raising her voice, she simply nodded once. "Understood, Mr. Lasker," she said quietly, and walked out of the gymnasium without looking back, her limp more pronounced now that the adrenaline had begun to recede, leaving behind an ache in her leg that had nothing at all to do with an old combat wound, and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of being punished for the one thing she had ever been unambiguously good at. Word of what had happened in the gymnasium moved through Somerville High School and then through the town itself with the particular speed reserved for stories too dramatic to stay contained, and by that evening, a local news van had parked outside the school, and a short segment about a heroic teacher talking down an armed former student had run on the 6 o'clock broadcast, though the report, hampered by the school's official statement, never mentioned that the teacher in question had already been fired for her trouble. It reached considerably further than the local news, however, because Kyle Doran's mother, sitting in a police station giving a statement about her son, had mentioned, almost as an aside, the calm, steady voice of the teacher who had talked him down, a woman named Kingston, who moved like she'd done something like this before. A detective, filling out his own report later that night, mentioned the name to his brother-in-law, who happened to work logistics at a nearby Army National Guard armory, who mentioned it during a call to a friend still on active duty, who happened to be a senior aide to General Robert Hale, 4-star Chief of Staff of the Army, currently in the region for an unrelated ceremony honoring 3 World War II veterans at a VFW hall 40 minutes away. General Hale had personally presented the Medal of Honor to exactly 11 soldiers during his career, and he remembered every single one of their names and faces with a clarity that had never once dimmed, because a man does not forget the particular weight of hanging that ribbon around someone's neck who had done what those soldiers had done. When his aide mentioned, almost in passing, a woman named Kingston who'd talked down an armed intruder at a high school outside town, something in the back of General Hale's memory snapped instantly into focus. Staff Sergeant Laura Kingston, he said slowly, setting down the coffee he'd been holding. Kandahar Province. She held a defensive position alone for 11 minutes with a shattered femur, and pulled 2 wounded men clear of a burning vehicle. I put that medal around her neck myself 4 years ago. He looked up at his aide. Get the car. We're going to that school. They arrived at Somerville High School at 7:40 the following morning, a black government sedan and 2 escort vehicles pulling into the front circle, just as the first buses were unloading students for the day, and General Robert Hale, in full dress uniform, 4 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder, stepped out onto the pavement with the particular unhurried gravity of a man who had traveled considerably out of his way, for exactly one reason. Gregory Lasker, arriving at the building moments later and spotting the vehicles from across the parking lot, hurried over with the visible alarm of a man entirely unaccustomed to 4-star generals appearing at his front doors before 8 in the morning. Can I help you, General? This is a public school. We weren't informed of any scheduled visit. I'm looking for Laura Kingston, Hale said, his voice carrying easily across the front circle, deep and unhurried in the particular way of men who had spent decades being obeyed the moment they finished a sentence. I understand she teaches history here. She did, Lasker said, some color draining from his face. There was an incident yesterday. A former student came onto campus armed. Ms. Kingston intervened without authorization, and given the significant liability concerns, the district made the decision to terminate her employment. General Hale's expression, weathered and composed through decades of far worse news than this, went very still. You fired her, he said, and the flatness of it carried more weight than any raised voice could have managed. The day after she walked unarmed toward a loaded rifle and talked a suicidal teenager into putting it down, you fired her. There were ongoing concerns about her physical fitness for the role, General. This wasn't solely about yesterday's incident. Her physical fitness, Hale repeated, and something in his voice made 2 students walking past with their backpacks slow down and stare. Do you know why Laura Kingston walks with a limp, Mr. Lasker? Lasker opened his mouth, found nothing adequate inside it, and closed it again. She earned that limp holding a defensive position alone, against an ambush that outnumbered her unit 4-1, after taking a round through her femur, so that 4 of her fellow soldiers could make it home to their families instead of coming home in flag-draped coffins, Hale said, his voice rising now, carrying across the growing crowd of students and staff gathering at a careful distance. I personally placed the Medal of Honor around her neck at the White House 4 years ago. It is the highest decoration this country has to offer, and there are fewer living recipients of it than there are people standing in this parking lot right now. And you fired her for walking toward a frightened, armed 19-year-old and talking him out of the worst decision of his life because you were worried about liability. The parking lot had gone entirely silent. dozens of students and arriving teachers frozen mid-step, staring at the four-star general standing in their school's front circle, with an expression that made Gregory Lasker visibly shrink several inches. "I didn't know," Lasker said, his voice barely audible now. "You had 1.5 years to ask," Hale said. "Where is she now?" Laura Kingston was 3 blocks away, sitting in her small kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, staring at nothing in particular, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. It was Coach Barnes of all people, his voice shaking with something that sounded almost like awe. "Laura, you need to come back to the school. Right now. There's a 4-star general standing in the parking lot, and he's asking for you by name, and he just told the entire building what you actually did in Kandahar." She arrived 20 minutes later to find the front circle of Somerville High School filled with students, teachers, and a gathering cluster of local news vans that had returned considerably faster than they'd left, and General Robert Hale standing at the center of it all, waiting. He turned as she approached, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The years and the distance, and the particular gravity of everything that had happened in that valley outside Kandahar, settling quietly into the space between them. "Staff Sergeant Kingston," Hale said finally, his voice softening into something considerably gentler than the tone he'd used with Lasker. "It's been a long time." "General," Laura said, her composure cracking slightly at the edges, "you didn't need to come all this way." "I absolutely did," Hale said. "You put yourself between a firearm and a frightened boy yesterday because it was the right thing to do, and this school responded by firing you before the ink dried on the police report. I wasn't about to let that stand without saying something about it." He straightened, squared his shoulders, and raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute, and the effect on the gathered crowd was immediate and electric. Dozens of phones rising to capture the sight of a 4-star general, saluting a woman, half of them had known only as the quiet history teacher with the limp. "Ma'am," Hale said, "on behalf of the United States Army, and every soldier who serves because you refused to stop fighting in that valley, thank you." Laura Kingston, who had spent 18 months at Somerville High School, trying very hard to be nothing more than an ordinary history teacher, raised her hand and returned the salute, tears finally slipping free, despite every effort to hold them back. Gregory Lasker, standing at the edge of the crowd with the particular hollow expression of a man watching his own judgment collapse in real time, found himself, for the first time in his career, entirely unable to think of a single thing to say. "Ms. Kingston's termination is rescinded, effective immediately, and this district will be issuing a formal apology," he managed finally, his voice small against the vastness of what had just happened around him. "That's not your call to make anymore, actually," Laura said, not unkindly, though something in her tone had shifted permanently. "I think I'm done here, Mr. Lasker, but thank you for finally saying it." She turned back to General Hale, who was watching her with an expression that held equal parts pride and quiet relief. "I might take you up on that job offer you made at the ceremony 4 years ago," she said, "the one about training cadre. I think I'm ready for a classroom that already knows exactly who's standing in front of it." "There's always a place for you," Hale said. "There always has been." Kyle Doran, released into his parents' custody pending juvenile proceedings that would eventually result in mandated counseling rather than prison, sent Laura a letter 3 weeks later, 4 lines long, thanking her for the only thing in the past year that had made him feel like someone was actually listening. She kept it in the same shoebox as her medal, tucked beneath the folded photograph from the White House, 2 small pieces of evidence that the same steady hands, capable of holding a defensive line alone in a war zone, were equally capable of holding a frightened boy back from the edge of his own worst decision. If Laura's quiet courage and unbreakable resolve moved you today, hit that like button and share her story with someone who needs a reminder that real strength rarely announces itself until the moment it's needed most. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories of hidden heroism and the price good people pay for being underestimated. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were standing in that gymnasium the day everything changed?